One thing I want to go into just very quickly is the key role that control systems play within the media and the scientific community. Now, this sort of surprises a lot of people, and some people they're not surprised. First, let's deal with science. One thing you have to remember about science is that scientists are humans first and scientists second, right? All of us. And there are scientists who pose as objective scientific folks who are on the payroll of various agencies. For example, in this cache of documents I received, there's a very famous astronomer, astrophysicist at Harvard named Dr. Donald Menzel. And Menzel was the chief UFO debunker who went around telling people none of this existed in the 1960s and all through that era. And he was on many panels, and he was the person who would look at evidence and then say, not true, not true, not true. It turned out, I have a document from the CIA where it talks about their contract with Dr. Donald Menzel at Harvard, and it said, but it cannot be acknowledged that he is being paid by us because the public needs to believe that he's an objective scientist telling the public from the perch of respectability at Harvard that this isn't true. So until the time of his death, this wasn't known. Now, in this cache of documents I got in 1994, officially released by the CIA, the provenance of this document is not in question. It names him. So just extrapolate that out, how easy it is to do that. Same thing with a guy named Professor Condon. Professor Condon was the head of the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado that had a contract in 1969 to look into UFOs so that the Air Force could determine whether to close Project Blue Book or not. Project Blue Book was actually a public relations stunt, mostly, to collect information from the public because there was so much outcry from the public of sightings and things that had happened, and the public, particularly Congressman Gerald Ford at the time, was furious that they were debunking events that had happened in Michigan that his constituents said were absolutely right there, here, E.T. craft right here. And Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who later came clean, is also an astrophysicist, made the famous comment that it was swamp gas. And later, of course, he said, we knew it wasn't swamp gas, we knew it was E.T. craft, and he left Project Blue Book as their chief consultant and started the Center for UFO Studies there in Chicago. But Professor Condon, around this time, was asked to head up an objective scientific committee to look into whether there was any veracity to UFOs. There was a lot of publicity around it. And like all government committees, it's always, when they form a committee, they already have it, it's a done deal. It's just window dressing. So he headed up this committee, a lot of scientific people, and Dr. Robert Wood, a Cornell PhD, worked for McDonnell Douglas, now part of Boeing. And actually, Dr. Wood, who is one of our Disclosure Project witnesses, it told me, and it's in his very lengthy testimony I have. You have to understand I have hundreds of hours of this kind of testimony on videotape. When he was working for McDonnell Douglas, old man McDonald himself asked him to look into UFOs and gather evidence. And so he began to do this. And he discovered a number of things, that A, they were real, B, they were interplanetary, C, they were using a type of gravity-controlled propulsion, and D, most interestingly, in many of the things that he looked into, he found that the ETs had electronic devices that were what I call technology-assisted consciousness and consciousness-assisted technologies, meaning that there was a trans-dimensional nexus between the electronics of these communication devices. I mean, you know, this goes at the speed of light. It's just junk, really. It's 1800s technology, and, you know, it's the Morse code. No offense, Apple. But they had technologies that interfaced seamlessly with electronics that would pick up directed intended thought, and which is absolutely true. And actually, the founder of Facebook, Zuckerberg, started talking about a thought switch to interface with computers. I don't know if he's been reading my material, but anyway, I started writing about that in 1990, 1991. And when Dr. Wood saw my comprehensive assessment of the UFO subject, which was written in '91, it got kind of moved through the agency and the aerospace community. And I was just starting this project, very obscure at that time, just this country doctor in North Carolina rattling around in an ER. And it made its way over to McDonnell Douglas, and I got this phone call from Dr. Wood, and he said, "You have no idea how right you are. How do you know this?" I said, "Well, I've had contact, and it's quite obvious. I mean, if you're any thinking person, you're not dealing with electronics that are the speed of light, or travel that's the speed of light. It's too slow. Because some of these are from other galaxies, like the picture we have of that one ET that's from Andromeda, 2.5 million light years from here. You know, they're not getting here at the speed of light. It'd take 2.5 million years to get here." So he said, "Well, I really want to meet with you at some point." So we kept in this relationship, and he eventually told me that when he was doing this work for McDonnell Douglas in the 60s, that he was put on the Condon Committee because they thought, because he was a very prestigious aerospace guy at a major aerospace company, that he would go along with the debunking whitewash of the Condon Committee. And Dr. Wood was someone who started bringing in boatloads of evidence. And it was turning the committee to the fact, no, these are absolutely real. So Professor Condon went to Old Man McDonald, head of McDonnell Douglas Aerospace, and said, "You fire that son of a bitch so I get him off this committee." And Mr. McDonald said, "No, I'm not going to fire him. He's a very good man." But he was thrown off the Condon Committee. But he didn't lose his job. McDonald stood by him. And that's an absolutely true story. And it came out in this cache of documents from the CIA, I got in '94, that Professor Condon and that committee, some of the key people, were on the payroll of the CIA. And it's in black and white. It's an uncontested document. University of Colorado Boulder, prestigious aerospace guy, and he was carrying water and doing the bidding of the intelligence community, all the time masquerading as an objective scientist. So this is why, you know, I have said, like Seth Shostak and those people who are with SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, they are either the stupidest people in the world, or they're on the payroll of somebody to lie to the public. You cannot be that stupid, given the dispositive evidence we put out there. And I actually debated on Voice of America, the head of the SETI project, Seth Shostak, and I had my disclosure project witnesses there. We basically cleaned his clock because the evidence is so dispositive and overwhelming if you go through our material archive. But this happens all the time. So if you just extrapolate, that goes a couple of examples throughout the professorial class and scientific class. It's how it's done. Now, in some cases, it's done not for payment so much as to protect your own reputation. For example, there was a guy named Carl Sagan. Everybody know who he is? You know, Cosmos series and all that. He actually was on the payroll of the intelligence community. And what happened is that Carl Sagan, there were some improprieties in his PhD thesis, which led to the intelligence community reaching out to him. And they basically said, "You're going to tell the public what we're going to tell you to tell the public, or you're going to be washing the floors at Cornell. You're not going to be a professor." And a good friend of his, two of his friends, George Fennell, who co-founded the Extrasolar Planetary Society and founded the Allegheny Observatory outside Pittsburgh, who's on my team, James Mullaney, who is a very eminent astronomer who was the editor of Sky Telescope magazine and Astronomy magazine, confirmed to me that this happened to Carl Sagan. And one of them told me that he aged 30 years in a month because he had to sell his soul to the devil. And so he went from someone looking into UFOs and actually said some positive things about their reality to being a chief debunker of them. And that was a real tragedy because they had what's called opposition research, like a political party had. They had dirt on him. And they used it to turn him. But to the public, you know, he was this renowned, respected scientific figure. So just magnify that all through society. That's how it operates. And I know it's not a very pretty picture. It's a little cynical. It's not cynical. It's just a reality. People need to, it's childhood's end here today. Wake up. This is how the world actually works. It's bare knuckle time. And that's one of the big problems, is that the same thing happens in the media. Everyone thinks we have a free press. We don't have a free press. We have a free press about things like the stain on the blue dress or something like that. Or other, you know, Kardashian's wardrobe. But on anything really critical like this, we do not have a free press. And I can give you many, many, many examples. I'll only give you a couple. And this involves both the mainstream news media and another one that involves Hollywood. Take this and extrapolate it. Ira Rosen won his Emmy working with Mike Wallace at ABC News. He then became the executive producer, ABC News New York, for Primetime Live in 2020. When we started moving forward with the Disclosure Project, he came out to my farm in Virginia and came out with a production team. I gave him 35 hours of top secret testimony and countless top secret documents. And he says, either this is the biggest hoax in the world or the biggest story in human history. And he says, I think it's the latter. I said, it is. He says, we're going to do a series of town hall meetings with your witnesses, and we're going to do a huge expose on this. I said, I don't think ABC will let you. And he said, I'm the executive producer and I have final decision over this. I said, Ira, I don't think they'll let you, but I'll cooperate here. You know, here's 20 years of research and all this effort. You can have it on a silver platter. No payment. I'm not a consultant. I give everything away for free. So he goes back to New York. He takes me up there. You know, there's Diane Sawyer and all these guys. Well, you know what's interesting? And I said, well, if you can make this happen, it's awesome. So a couple weeks later, he calls me up rather sheepishly. And he says, Dr. Greer, they're not going to let me do this story. And I said, well, Ira, I thought you said you had total control over programming for Primetime Live. He says, Dr. Greer, not for this. And I said, well, who are they? He says, Dr. Greer, you know who they are. And that was the end of it. And we've stayed in touch. He's now back with 60 Minutes. But that was one of the reasons why many of you may remember that Mike Wallace went on Larry King Live and had a deep depressive breakdown. And he talked about, he kept saying, I was a fraud, I'm a fraud. And part of it is that a guy named Schwartz, who was on the board of Time Life, and I met. And he was very good friends with Mike Wallace. And Mike Wallace had gotten a hold of a cache of these documents. And I was in New York at a party. And Bob Schwartz said to me, he says, look, he said, the media has become the scribe taking dictation from the right hand of the king, and particularly on something like this. And so Mike Wallace, who was this esteemed investigative reporter, couldn't touch the biggest investigative reporting story in history. And he felt like a total fraud and went into a deep depression over it. If you take Hollywood, the same thing happens. The only movies you really see that come out anymore, now Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Spielberg was a docudrama. He was given access to some of the secret files at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's true. If you haven't seen that movie, go see it. It's classic. But in modern times, that was in the 70s, I think, it just isn't possible. The studios are completely mobbed up with people, just like these scientists who actually are on the payroll, with people that respond to the intelligence community. So Arnold Kopelson was a huge producer, had multi-billion-dollar in gross sales for his movies, flew me out to LA. He wanted to do an enormous expose, true life story, be like Argo, but based on my work and what I've done. It'd be a thriller, because you have murder, you have mayhem, you have intrigue, you have ET contact, you have the whole thing. He loved it. And he was there, and I was at 20th Century Fox, and he had a $60 million discretionary budget to do any movie he wanted, pre-approved, because he was a big name. And I said, well, Arnold, I don't think they're going to let you do this one. He says, oh, yes, I'm Arnold Kopelson, and I've done this. And he took me to his vanity wall of all his awards. I said, great, wonderful, give me a call. So he sends one of his chief assistants here to D.C. when we're doing the private closed briefings for members of Congress in April of 1997. And she goes back, and he goes below. He said, this is the most incredible bunch of information, because we filmed all that. And so I let him have that closed briefing film. He says, this is going to be the biggest movie. It'll be bigger than E.T. or Close Encounters or any of them, and certainly it'd be bigger than something like Avatar. I said, well, good, do it. So, but I don't know if they'll let you. He says, why do you say that? I said, well, let's see. Let's put it in, start it down the path, and let's see what happens. A few weeks later, I get a call from Arnold Kopelson. He says, Dr. Greer, they won't let me do this movie. I said, oh, Arnold, I thought you had this $60 million already in the bank ready to roll. He says, not for this. Fox has killed it, put it in turnaround faster than 10 light years of light speed. So it went into turnaround and got killed. And turnaround means when you take a film and basically kill it. So that's what happened, and it's happened. I give you this example. If I'd be here until tomorrow morning giving you examples I've had with the media, the mainstream media, where this has happened over and over and over again. So one of the problems is the big media do not allow certain things to be exposed. And we have been brainwashed to think that we're the land of the free and have a free press and a free market, etc. But we do only within a certain confine. But ironically, that confine is a prison. Because how do you have a free market if the most important technologies and information of the last 100 years is sequestered and can't be used? I mean, that's not a free market. That's a managed market and controlled, and it is. Same thing with the media. So that's really how that works, and you need to understand that's a very important component of how magic infiltrates and operates. And keep that in mind whenever you start seeing a major media report. And now with the internet, we can put something out and it can reach, ironically, we can put a video out and it'll have 5 million views, and it'll reach more people than Larry King Live used to, or most of the CNN talk show hosts get. So luckily we're able to bypass it now, but back in the good old days. But even then it's sort of relegated to mainstream. The thing that people respect for their source of news, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, et cetera, and so on, won't touch this in a credible way. And if they start to, and believe me, there have been many initiatives from the Wall Street Journal approached me, wanted to do a huge story, gets killed, gets killed, gets killed. So there are operatives that are embedded in the integrated corporations of all of these media holding companies. And it will not make it out. And that has been my experience to date. I'd love to be surprised.